that Russia offered the reunification of Germany in 1952 and 1954 on condition of German neutrality, that the Soviet Union offered a general European collective security system in a treaty in 1954 open to all social systems, that the Warsaw Pact was only formed in 1955 after 6 years after the start of NATO, following the rejection of these overtures. How many people know that? Was Kennan wrong in 1996, when he was aged 92, to say that NATO expansion into former Soviet territory was a strategic blunder of potentially epic proportions? Or when he warned in the same interview against a foreign policy that was utopian in its expectation, legalistic in its concept, moralistic and self-righteous? I find Kennan a deeply satisfying guide to the present. But just as he was simultaneously accused of being anti-Soviet and pro-Soviet, I find myself sounding anti-Russian when I speak in Russia, and pro-Russian when I speak in the UK or the United States. For there's a lot that's wrong with Russia, and that needs to be said, and said loudly. The regime's fake democracy and fake religiosity, its corruption, its media censorship, its rigged judiciary, its persecution of NGOs, they offend me. But one has to say that except for corruption, they do not offend most Russians. But the West also needs to be told that if the present Cold Peace escalates into a new Cold War, it will be chiefly responsible for that. How many people know that Gorbachev promised the reunification of Germany, accepted the reunification of Germany on the promise that NATO would not expand beyond Germany? How many people know that he proposed a new Atlantic European collective security system to supersede both NATO and the Warsaw Pact? How many people in the room can share the shame and humiliation Russians felt in the 1990s when their country was invaded by swarms of Harvard MBAs, armored against reality by their ignorance, preaching democracy and the free market, only to let loose a cabal of criminals to bleed the country dry? Or understand how Western democracy and free markets came to be associated in the Russian mind with disorder and disintegration? How many people know that Putin backed America fully at the time of 9/11 and over the protests of his own military made Russian bases available to US forces? How many people know that Putin wanted to join NATO in 2001? I listened to this whole narrative of the jilted lover from Putin's own lips at Sochi a couple of months ago. Far from joyfully accepting Russia as a partner in the war against Islamic terrorism, this was what Putin said, Western policy had deliberately set out to weaken and dismember the post-communist state through the interlocking instruments of an eastward expansion of NATO, from fomenting orange revolutions in Ukraine and Georgia, financing every anti-Russian NGO going. So Russia had to hit back somehow. That was the narrative. That was the narrative. I'm not saying that is the correct narrative. That is the Russian narrative. And 80 or 90% of Russians do believe it. Well, Russia's Ukraine story is simply the latest chapter in this general anti-Western moan. As the Russians tell it, an illegal coup against the democratically elected government of President Yanukovych brought extreme anti-Russian nationalists to power in Kiev on the 22nd of February of last year. Russia's seizure of Crimea was a preemptive strike against US military deployment. Russian communities in Crimea and in the Donbass were forced to organize in self-defense against persecution and even massacre. Russian volunteers from across the border came to the aid of their beleaguered brothers. The Western narrative, you will not be surprised to hear, is almost the polar opposite of this. The fall of the evil empire was a victory for human rights, democracy, free markets, and in general, the Western values. Russian failure to take advantage of the opportunities this opened up must be attributed to a form of recidivism, rooted not just in communism, but deep in Russian history. On Ukraine, where Russians talk of a nationalist coup orchestrated, organized, and financed by the CIA, the West sees a popular uprising against a corrupt, despotic, and increasingly violent government. Whereas Russia talks of Russian volunteers helping threatened fellow Russians, the West sees an invasion of Ukraine by Russia's armed forces in an opportunistic attempt to stop the Ukraine pivoting its foreign and economic policy on Europe and the West. In short, both sides accuse the other of deliberately manipulating Ukrainian domestic politics for their own advantage. And both are right. Because the Ukrainian state is a highly vociferous, unstable entity. As former Czech President Václav Klaus pointed out, the state of Ukraine today is a sad outcome of Stalin's attempts to mix up nations and boundaries, disrupt historical ties, and create a new Soviet man by turning original nations into mere ethnic, residual, and historical leftovers. And the Ukrainian state remained in this situation. It failed to legitimize itself to sizable fractions of its own population. No common Ukrainian identity has been created since 1991. There was no political transformation. Democracy has been a sham, with disputed elections and messy power transfers. In the economy, wealth is fought over by alternating Russian and non-Russian oligarchic clans to the accompaniment of stagnation, industrial decay, and high unemployment. In fact, the Ukrainian economy is in free fall at the moment. So Ukraine was ripe for the manipulation of its internal politics by Russia and the West. Russia to keep it within its sphere of influence, and the West to pull it towards the EU and NATO. We have, in fact, two different worldviews, not as polarized as they were during the Cold War, but so far apart that one sometimes despairs of dialogue. To decide between them, I'm not proposing to do. It would take us too deep into civilizational questions. And here again, I'm quite contested in my own mind, because I'm a British lord, member of the parliament, but with Russian ancestry. I speak Russian, and therefore I do understand what the Russians are saying in their own language. There are Western-leaning Russian liberals, brave and admirable people, but they do not reflect popular sentiment. But this is exactly where Kennan was so wise in saying that foreign policy should be based on interests, not values. What would he be advising now? I imagine Barack Obama turning to him and saying, "George, the Russians are getting a bit footloose. How would you contain them?" I can't hope to give an answer in the minute or two remaining, but I can readily believe that George Kennan would have said two things. First, get off your moral high horse. Stop lecturing. It only makes Russians, and incidentally the whole of the non-Western world, more intransigent. Look after security, and morals will look after themselves. Second, let's work out what America's real interests in the region are. Would they be served if Ukraine joined NATO? Would they be harmed if Ukraine doesn't join NATO or keeps Crimea? Surely, Kennan might have continued, we can do a trade here. No NATO membership for Ukraine in return for the reassertion of Kyiv sovereignty over the Donbass. In return, Ukraine to be offered a new martial aid to clean up its economy and prepare it for membership of the EU. Deprived of NATO membership, a Western-leaning Ukraine would lose most of its sting for Russia. And who knows, a post-Putin Russia might even want to follow it, Ukraine, into an expanded European Union and a pan-European, even Atlantic collective security system. Those are the prizes. Now, I don't know whether Kennan would be saying precisely these things, but from reading Gaddis's magnificent biography of Kennan, this is the way I think his mind would have been moving, and I do think ours should be as well. Thank you. Anyone want to say anything, ask me anything? I'll do my best to answer.
We do have a microphone here. Unfortunately, it's not wireless, so if you can
get over here.
So in your talk today, you talked about Putin, and you said that for his own political reasons, he is not interested in restoring the Russian economy. And you promised to elaborate on that tonight, so I'm taking you up on your promise.
Well, as I said just now, there are lots of things that are bad about Russia, and they ought to be said. I don't think they should be hidden. And one of them is the whole economic mess, the dead end of its development model. What I argued this morning was that the non-diversification of the Russian economy, in other words, its continuance as a petro-economy, was integral to the continuation of the Putin system of power. And that's why they haven't really brought Russia into the knowledge economy era. It does remain an economy that's dependent on energy and minerals and food production. But at the same time, that contradicts Putin's aim of making Russia an important actor on the world stage, because the Russian economy really remains too small to sort of play the role, even of defending its own sphere of influence, as it calls it. I mean, as the Americans said, look, China is entitled to a sphere of influence because it's strong enough to assert itself in its near abroad, whereas Russia isn't. And so there's this contradiction between an economic policy that keeps Russia actually in a poor state of development, and a foreign policy which harks back to the days when Russia was a superpower and could look America in the face on more or less equal terms. And that's unresolved. And I don't think it'll be resolved until Russia develops a more democratic, plural system where the transfer of power does not threaten the personal interests of all the power holders who have simply been feeding off the rents of the economy. That's why